Welcome to the Coming Home Well podcast, the show that educates, supports, and advocates for the veteran community. Your host, Dr. Tyler Piron, U.S. Army retired, will bring you exciting conversations with amazing guests about resources, research, and military history, all geared to helping our warriors to come home well. Here's your host, Dr. Tyler Piron.
Welcome back to Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Tyler Piron. And today we are having another podcast on to talk about what they do. Now, we've done this before once or twice, and we've talked to other organizations that kind of have podcasts. But this one's kind of cool because it's the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, and they have a podcast, and it's called Echoes of the Vietnam War. They have it on Apple Podcasts and all that. And Michael Croan is going to talk to us. He is the host. Welcome to the show, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well.
Oh yeah, thanks a lot for asking us to be here. It's a real pleasure.
You know, I always talk about the Vietnam War as the complete opposite of the global war on terror. The way the veterans were treated at the Vietnam War was always not a good thing. It shaped a generation or multiple generations about how we viewed veterans. And then the complete opposite has turned around with the global war on terror and everything since 9/11. So I always find the stories about Vietnam just so fascinating because it was such a different kind of fight. What in the world got you involved with the Vietnam War and telling their stories?
Yeah, well, I've been a writer for 30 years for a living, and I'd known Jim Knott, our CEO, some years ago, and I was catching up with him by phone one day, and he said, I've got this kind of backlog of content that we need to produce for our website. And we're a small staff, we're a nonprofit, we run lean, and it's on everybody's plate, but nobody can get to it. So, how would you feel about helping us out with that backlog? And I said, sure, Jim's a good friend, and I'd probably follow him into a burning building if he asked me to. And so I got involved that way. I started writing content for the website, and that didn't last long. And then he started asking me to do some oral histories. And so I did a couple of those. And then he said, what I really want to do is a podcast. And how would you feel about taking that on? And I said, well, I don't have any experience at all doing a podcast. And he said, well, all the technical stuff you can learn, right? What you have is an ability to find sort of the narrative seam and expose it and enhance it and, tell really compelling stories. He said, that's the hard part. The technical stuff is easy compared to that. So I told him that I was willing to give it a shot. And last week we published our 50th episode, and the podcast has now been downloaded more than 180,000 times. So it's just grown beyond anybody's expectations in terms of speed and reach and all those things. But to go back to what you were saying earlier about that Vietnam generation and how different things are, it's different because of them. They are the reason why the men and women fighting the global war on terror are having such a different experience. And, at the risk of alienating, any of our friends who might be in the World War II generation, for my money, that Vietnam generation is the greatest generation. Because they faced so much adversity, not just during the conflict in Southeast Asia, but when they came home. As you said, there were no, the welcome home was very different if it existed at all. There was a lot of hostility, a lot of controversy. The guys had trouble finding jobs. Some of them felt like they couldn't even say where they'd been, for the last year, 2 years. And yet, despite all of that, despite what they experienced in Southeast Asia, and despite what they endured when they got home, they changed America. That was a defining moment for this country. Everything changed after Vietnam, politically, culturally, militarily. This is the generation that reshaped the VA, so that it could be more responsive to the needs of people who had fought in Vietnam. And it was run by World War II and Korea vets, and it just wasn't responsive to the particular needs of that generation. So they changed that. They changed, the way that we fight wars, right? The role of the helicopter in combat was really defined. during Vietnam. They changed combat medicine. They changed the way that we use dogs in the military. The list just goes on and on and on of the impact that these men and women had on this country after they got home, and in a lot of cases weren't welcomed appropriately. So I think, for a generation of fighting men and women to come home and make that kind of positive change after, the way they were treated, dealing with all sorts of issues, from Agent Orange exposure, levels of PTSD that were sort of off the charts. It's amazing to me that they came home and had such a positive, lasting impact.
It is
for my money, that's the Clovis generation.
I totally see where you're coming from with that, because it's one thing when the whole country is behind you fighting a war, very much World War II, not quite as much in Korea, but it was still there. And then Vietnam, it was, we're not with you. In fact, we shouldn't be there, and blah, blah, blah. And blaming the soldier for the decisions of the politicians. And I think, and that's something that's so divorced.
If you came home from fighting in Normandy, that you didn't have any trouble finding a job. Everybody wanted a war hero on the payroll. You came home from Vietnam, and it was rolling the dice to even mention that you had been there if you were looking for work.
Absolutely. And it definitely changed. You brought this up, how the Gulf War and everybody post 9/11 was treated by the entire population, even if they were against the war. And I think that's a huge difference. You could be totally against going to Iraq or Afghanistan, and I'm sure lots of people who have been to both have, some second guessing about why we were there. But we went, and it wasn't held against the soldiers or the Marines or the service members that went. It was held against the politicians and things like that. It is totally a different vibe. And so
it is. And if you look at where I don't have any sociological data to back this up, but I having spent the last couple of years hearing and sharing these stories, if you look at the tip of the spear, right, the root cause of that change, right, the reason why people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan were treated the way they were was because the Vietnam guys made sure of it. They made sure of it. They swore to each other that they would not allow another generation of fighting men and women to come home to the welcome that they received.
Oh, absolutely. It is interesting capturing the history. It's almost like some time has to pass before we start worrying about the history and the oral history and the stories. Now, we've done it somewhat because we're the YouTube generation and Instagram and Vines, and you'll see 1,001 clips of somebody with a video camera in Iraq or Afghanistan out in some fob somewhere in a firefight. And Ukraine is very much this way now. It's like everything is on camera. You could go on every day and watch something happening. But in Vietnam, there were pictures, and it was only sort of getting to the individual levels sometimes, but it was the first televised war. And that must have had a significant impact as well.
You bet it did. And, I think you asked why I got into this, right? When all of these dynamics that we're talking about, right? Why we were there, the way the war was waged, the seminal kind of experiences that these fighting men and women endured, the way that they were treated when they came home, what they went on to do despite all of that. I mean, that's just a petri dish for amazing, amazing stories, at the 50,000 foot level and at the 50-foot level. And so, and I just am in love with stories. So, there's just no end in sight in terms of how many different ways we can look at this conflict and at the individual experiences that people went through. And, I hear this all the time. Every Vietnam experience is unique to the person who experienced it. You can talk to two guys who were in the same unit at different times, or who were there at the same time, but in different geographic areas, guys who were there in the same geographic area at the same time, but had two different jobs or were in two different branches. It's amazing to me that they feel this sense of shared experience when so many of them had experiences that were unique.
It's always interesting. I've been to Iraq, I've been to Afghanistan, and I always try to like compare, it's sort of my mental map of the way Vietnam was with all the medals and the constant fighting and the type of fighting. And it was obviously different than Iraq and Afghanistan. It was like that insurgency / full combat operations. Whereas that didn't happen a whole lot except the very beginning of Iraq and the very, very beginning of Afghanistan. And then after that, it's pretty much insurgency, counterterrorism. But then you learn so much from what they did in Vietnam that we forgot about. And you alluded to it earlier about dogs and IEDs and pitfalls and booby traps and all these things. And so like we had to relearn what we had known and then try to do it again.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, when you're talking to these folks, how much do they reference like the current events? Because obviously you've had 50 podcasts, you've talked to a lot of people. Do they ever contrast and compare the current operations going on in the world that they're reading in the news with what they did in Vietnam?
Yeah, in a couple of cases, I've had people comment on, sort of current conflicts and the way they're being run. It's not something that comes up a lot, though. I'll tell you. I've had a couple of guests who were senior officers in the military. In most cases, career officers, right? They came back from Vietnam and did another 20 or 30 years after that, in the military. Those guys tend to have, some strong opinions and pay an awful lot of attention. But I would say, I don't know what the numbers are exactly, but it feels like maybe 2/3 of the veterans I talked to came home and didn't stay in the military. And so, they may have opinions about how things are going present day, but it's not something that comes up an awful lot. When I talk to them about present day, it tends to be a lot more personal, what they're doing today in terms of just involvement with the veterans community. And sometimes it's on a small scale. Like the very first episode, we talked to a guy who started turning wood and found that it was just amazing for his PTSD. So now he's teaching other veterans in his local VVA chapter how to turn wood. Then the guys he's teaching are from Afghanistan and Iraq, and they're finding peace in this activity that's, almost Zen-like. It's almost meditative. Or it could be on a huge scale. That same episode, I talked to Everett Alvarez, who was the naval aviator shot down. I believe he was the first naval aviator shot down and taken prisoner. I think he spent close to 8 years in the Hanoi Hilton.
Mm-hmm.
And he came home and became deputy head of the VA and was one of the very first people to say, this institution is not responsive to the particular needs of people coming home from Southeast Asia and led the charge to change the VA. So they come home and they, in many cases, they just go on to live sort of normal lives, but eventually a lot of them anyway, tend to find some way, small or large, to make a positive impact.
That's a great
when I
point.
talk to them about what they're doing now, that's kind of where the conversation tends to go. It's a little bit less about commenting on current events or news.
A little more focus on the people behind the service, the folks that served and are coming back, and they recognize how poorly they were treated and how things weren't set up for them. And then going, hey, these are some of the things that would make it better.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm always amazed at that. So I know you've talked to a lot of different people that served in Vietnam. Maybe what's one or two of your favorite or most interesting or most surprising stories?
Yeah. Well, gosh, even that's a hard question. Because I have, it depends on how you look at it, right? One of my personal favorites is, it's actually a two-parter. Episodes 7 and 8 were called Rocket Man Part 1 and Rocket Man Part 2, and told the story of a Marine Lance Corporal named Bill Clovis, his experience in Vietnam. But it was also the story of his daughter, Casey Byington, and telling their stories sort of in parallel to each other was just astounding, because Bill was wounded by friendly fire in, I think it was 67 or 68, sustained traumatic brain injury, and just a laundry list of other injuries. I mean, he was blown 30 feet through the air. I mean, he was blown almost to pieces, but he came home intact, and the Marine Corps just spat him out into society. Pair of jeans and t-shirt, and off you go. No interest in making sure that he received any sort of long-term care, any sort of transition back to the world. And so, Bill got out of the Marine Corps in San Francisco, and you can imagine what that was like, walking around San Francisco with your high and tight in 1968 or 69. But he got through, a few difficult years, and they settled down and got married, and he had, a bunch of kids and had a very normal life, had a career, built a career, raised a family, took the kids to Disney World, Disneyland, did all the stuff that, normal people do. And then one day, 47 years after his injury, he walked into Casey's kitchen and just had a meltdown. Just fell to pieces in her kitchen. Well, this was the first time Casey had seen any of that, right? She didn't see that. Her father, he never showed any of that, any of those signs in her lifetime. And so she was not equipped. She didn't know what to do for him, but she knew that she would figure it out. And her story of advocating for him, getting him the care that he needed, picking fights with the federal government, picking fights with the United States Marine Corps to get him the level of care that he had earned and the Purple Heart that he had earned, which he finally received almost 50 years after his injury. That story, those stories, his and her stories, are told across 2 episodes. And that is one that I think just really, really sticks with me. But I have others that, that stick with me for different reasons. I think I took an honor flight with a group of, a lot of people don't even know that this existed, but the Navy had an attack helicopter squadron. It was stood up in Vietnam and stood down in Vietnam. So unlike other units, there was no stateside base for them to come back to. They only existed in Vietnam. And they were called the HAL 3 Seawolves. And Honor Flight San Diego organized a trip to Washington, D.C. It was the first honor flight that I'm aware of that was, first of all, 100% Vietnam veterans. Usually it's a mixed group. And secondly, all from the same unit, all from the same outfit. I don't think that any honor flight in the country has done that, had done that prior. And so,
no, I'm pretty sure I've talked to several of the honor flight folks, and it's always by conflict. I've never heard of it by the same unit.
Right. And so I flew to San Diego and accompanied that group of, I think it was 87 or 88 Seawolves on their honor flight to DC. That's a favorite of mine just because, again, just unbelievable stories that nobody has heard. I mean, there's a documentary called Scramble the Seawolves made by a guy named Jeff Arbaio and his wife, Shannon. Shannon's father had been a Seawolf, which is how they knew about it. And they made this documentary called Scramble the Seawolves. I'd never heard of it. I watched it on my way to San Diego on the plane on my laptop. And it was, I mean, it's just mind blowing what these guys, the ingenuity, right? That for the Navy to stand up its own attack helicopter squadron. I mean, these guys, there was no playbook. They wrote the playbook as they were fighting. And if you talk to Navy SEALs or River Rats about who their heroes are, Seawolves are at the top of the list.
I'm going to have to go listen to that episode because I am not familiar with the Seawolf story at all. It's probably in some movie or something that I haven't watched, but you always hear about the Brownwater Navy and, the SEALs and the riverine operations, and you see that.
Right.
But I had not heard about the Seawolves and Navy attack helicopters. That's just, those two things don't go together.
They're the ones who provided the close air support for SEALs and riverine operations in the Delta. It is an amazing story. I highly recommend Scramble the Seawolves, the documentary. But if you want to check out that was another one that was a 2-parter. Those are the only two-parters that we've done. I believe it's 40 and 41. Scramble the Seawolves. It's another of my favorites. And it's because the stories are so rich and so vivid. And I'm enriched personally by having stood next to these guys for a few days. There's one of the Seawolves who sort of prominently featured across those 2 episodes named Tex. Morgan. And I think Tex and I are wired for life. I think that connection is meaningful and lasting. At least it is for me. I can't speak for Tex.
It is always amazing just to hear the stories, and it doesn't matter what the conflict is. As soon as you get veterans together, all of a sudden there's this instant camaraderie and just sort of a discussions that happen. You'll see it at the USO at the airport, or anytime you have different eras and different conflicts and different types of service. And all of a sudden you get a bunch of veterans together, and then all of a sudden they're all talking and sharing stories and joking and getting that camaraderie together. I would imagine it was magnified many times when they were all part of the same unit in Vietnam over a period of time.
Tex saw his bunkmate on that trip for the first time in 50 years. His hoochmate. These guys, some of them, there was a knot of them who had seen each other once or twice, or maybe, a little more than that over the course of 50 years. But for most of them, at least the ones I talked to, first time they've been around Seawolves since they left Vietnam. It was heavy, man. It was amazing to watch. Another favorite of mine, just because it just opened a window for me into a world that I didn't know existed. We did an episode called Missing in Action, and forgive me, I don't know the episode number off the top of my head, but I think it might be around 13. And one of the people I interviewed, we talk not just to veterans, we get stories from Gold Star wives, Gold Star children, people who were otherwise affected by that conflict who didn't necessarily fight it. I talked to a woman named Rebecca Rutt. She's a 7-time world champion endurance athlete. She's also the sister of Major General Sharon Bannister, who's on our board. But I talked to Rebecca because she had ridden 1,200 miles, the entirety of the Ho Chi Minh Trail on her bicycle. And it was so that she could stand at the map coordinates where her father was shot down in Laos.
Isn't that crazy?
It's unreal. And that's another great documentary. It's called Blood Road. Everybody that I talk to makes me feel like I'm just so pathetic and weak and soft and insignificant. These people are so inspiring. Casey Byington and Diane Parisi and Rebecca Rush. Some of the most incredible human beings I've talked to are women who were affected by that war because their fathers went missing, their brothers went missing, their husbands came home and suffered for years from Agent Orange exposure. And there's another woman in Texas named Natasha Sprague. Her father died from Agent Orange related illness just a few years ago, handful of years ago, but it came on very, very suddenly, and it took him very, very quickly. And he never talked about his experience in Vietnam. He discovered all of this, most of it, after he was gone.
And that's always such the challenge. Like I've talked about it before. My grandfather was in World War II, and I joined the Army when I was very young. And we had that in common, but we never talked about his service. And so I've always wondered, what did he do? I didn't get that story because he wouldn't talk about it, and I knew he had nightmares, and, he'd wake up screaming and even many, many years later, probably 30, 40 years later. And so it wasn't until many years after that, I figured out, Grandpa had PTSD pretty bad. But, he was a kind person. He was wonderful, all these things. But I didn't know, and you wouldn't know, especially the World War II generation. They didn't talk about it. They didn't get help. They didn't have the resources. Nobody even addressed it. And then in Vietnam, it was even more so. And now we're starting to address it, and it's a big change. But the behind the service, the family members, the friends, the cousins, the brothers, the wives, the kids, all of those people are affected by service, and we often don't recognize that. And so to hear you talk about it is heartwarming to me, because that's one of the areas that I'm always trying to address. And it's a little bit harder to get those stories than it is sometimes to get the stories from the veterans themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Diane Parisi, I mentioned her husband came home from Vietnam. had a very normal life, but began to suffer some physical symptoms of Agent Orange exposure. Eventually, it took his life. Through that process of trying to get him the care that he needed, Diane learned how difficult it was at that time for anybody to get help for that. And so, Diane spends a lot of her free time helping veterans and their families navigate that labyrinthine system to get the care that they deserve, because she's been down that road and she knows how difficult it was, and it makes her angry, and she feels like, one way that she can honor her husband's memory is by making sure that other families have an easier time of it. And, I think she just does this in her spare time. It's not like an organization. It's not like a nonprofit that she's founded. I mean, she's just doing this because word's getting around and people come to her for help. I mean, these are incredible human beings.
So I know you've talked to a lot of people, and I asked you what was the most special, the most memorable, or whatever. What was the saddest, the most difficult topic you've addressed with the Vietnam veterans and the echoes from Vietnam War?
I mean, it's generally speaking, it was just the failure of our failure as a nation, institutionally, culturally, to provide any measure of care. And, more specifically, it's the stories of people who came home and dealt with illness from Agent Orange exposure, or who came home and dealt with, the nightmares, the cold sweats, the violent outbursts, in some cases, the substance abuse, the suicide as a result of coming home from an unimaginable horror and finding that nobody wanted to hear about it. And so you just bottle it up, right? Come home and nobody wants to hear about what you did, and if they do want to hear about it, it's so that they can vilify you with it. And so I think that's the saddest thing for me, is how much these guys had to buy. You would not believe how many veterans I talk to who can't talk about it to this day without getting choked up. They're deeply, deeply affected by it.
And just sort of burying it and sort of suppressing it until one day, just like that young lady with her dad, all of a sudden they couldn't handle it.
Yeah. Well, that guy, before he was injured and his war ended, they were deep in the boonies, for several days. And his best friend was killed and died in his arms. And they were a long way from helicopter support. And so he had to zip his best friend into a body bag and carry him for 3 days.
I don't even know how you deal with that, like long term. I mean, just picturing it, because, we don't do those sort of things today. We have a lot more transportation and communication and all these things. And that kind of isolation, just even for me, I'm like, that's crazy.
Yeah. I think if I recall correctly, that his friend died, they were supposed to be, it was supposed to be some sort of, ceasefire or some agreement, to kind of ratchet down hostilities because of Christmas. But his unit was sent out anyway on ambush, on patrol. And I think that's why he ended up having to carry his friend for 3 days, because this all happened right. If I'm not mistaken, I think maybe this stuff all happened right around Christmas. In any case, they couldn't get him out any other way. So Bill threw him over his shoulder, his rocket launcher over the other shoulder, and kept walking and kept fighting.
That's just crazy. But those are the types of stories that you hear all the time from the Vietnam veterans, where it was like all this sacrifice, all this mayhem, all this very intense fighting, which we do sporadically. Depends on where you are in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or any of the other dozens of places we have people nowadays. We have it sporadically, but it wasn't the sort of intense on your own, but out in the boondocks by yourself. I mean, obviously we have patrol bases and FOBs and other things that are out from the main base camps, but it's a lot different now than it was. And so it's sometimes hard for me. I'm imagine it's just as hard for the Vietnam veterans and the World War II veterans, because the conflicts were so different. where people had just were, the nature of fighting was different.
Well, not only the nature of fighting, but the nature of how we built up our military, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the draft was, I mean, all due respect to people who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, they volunteered, right?
Yep.
Some of these guys who didn't, I mean, Bill Clovis was 17 years old and he got busted siphoning gas out of a car. And the judge said, you can go to jail or you can go to Vietnam. He was 17. 50 years later, he's still dealing with that. So, I mean, we did an episode on the draft. That was another one that was a real eye-opener for me. I didn't host that one. My colleague, Callie Wright, who I miss dearly, she's left the organization and gone back to teaching, but she did a great job with that episode. She interviewed a couple of veterans, one of whom was drafted in a really small rural town in Georgia by a draft board, and another one who was in New York City. And it was so fascinating. The one from New York City said, your draft notice in the mail, and before you open it, you would feel the envelope, because if you were coming home from that appointment, there'd be 2 subway tokens in the envelope. If there was only 1 subway token in the envelope, you knew you weren't coming home from that appointment.
Oh, wow. So they pay for you to go there.
I'm getting chills.
Yeah. No,
I'm getting chills just telling you about that detail, right?
And we don't have the draft right now, and thank God for that. But it does change the people that are there. I mean, we talk about now the standards of enlistment, and during the height of the surge in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they started letting people in that would not otherwise been able to join the military, and changing standards. And we talk a lot about that, and we spill a lot of ink trying to discuss the right and the wrong. And then we have the utter opposite, which was, Vietnam, which was, if you weren't well connected, you were going, or you're well connected and you want to burnish a political career, you're going to go, but we're going to try to put you somewhere mostly safe. And that's sort of my takeaway of what I've always thought about the draft in Vietnam. Yeah.
Fortunate Son, right? That's another episode we did. The music of the Vietnam era. That's our number 1 episode by a large, large margin. We told stories about the Tet Offensive and Khe Sanh and Donut Dollies. And we talked to people who were, famous, like Dale Dye and Anne Margaret. None of that has come close to the popularity of the episode on the music of that era, which is,
I would imagine. I mean, amazing. Even nowadays, we have it's almost a meme or where you have a button in the helicopter for Fortunate Son when you're getting ready to go fight. And you can buy it like it's, like a military switch in a helicopter to turn on the Fortunate Son song. And it's labeled as such because it goes how much that's part of the culture of the military now. And so we joke about it. And people buy these stickers and, put it on like, hey, when the song comes on, it's time to go fighting.
That's what I mean about the legacy of this generation, right? When I say that it changed America militarily, politically, culturally. I mean, it's just that forgive me, the echoes of that generation, are still everywhere. Everywhere I look, I see it now. And I feel like it's a privilege to help get those stories out into the world.
So, folks, we're talking with Michael Croan. It's with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, and they have a podcast. It's called Echoes of the Vietnam War. It's a podcast. It's on iTunes. It's on all the places you get your podcast. So go listen to them if you're at all interested in Vietnam War or military history. And they have a ton of really great episodes. Michael, before I let you go, I've asked you about a number of things, but I'm sure there are things that I should have. What should I have asked you about but didn't?
Well, we've talked about, the 50 episodes that we've done today. We haven't talked at all about the future of the podcast and where we'd like to see it go from here. I don't know if that's interesting.
That is.
Yeah. So I think, with 50 episodes in the bag and more than 180,000 downloads, we've done all of that organically, right? There's been very little promotion. There's we're a nonprofit. We're a really small staff. The podcast is me and a couple of colleagues. and no budget really to speak of other than, getting some occasional travel approved. Most of the interviews I do, the vast majority, I do over Zoom. I think what we'd like to get to is, and then there's also, just because of limited resources, there's the tension between narrative storytelling and an interview format. And our podcast is sort of a mix right now. I would like to tilt that mix a little more in favor of narrative storytelling, but that takes time and that takes resources. And so, we'd like to get to a point where we can gather more of these stories faster. We can produce them more thoughtfully and more lovingly, and we can promote them more vigorously beyond, our immediate circle of people who support VDMF. So ideally, I think sometime this year, we will, if things go well, we'll land ourselves some sort of sponsor or underwriter who can help fund those three things, better, faster gathering, better production, because I'm still learning how to produce a podcast, and anybody who listens will probably hear that. It's pretty apparent. And then thirdly, just, growing the audience, making more people aware of it. Really, really surprised and proud of the growth that we've managed so far, but I'd like to be a little bit more deliberate about taking it to the next level. And, we're going to need some support in order to do that.
I think you're going to probably get a lot of support as people even more so hear about what you guys are doing and the podcast and the history. What is the best way for someone that's interested in the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund or the Echoes of the Vietnam War podcast? How would they get in touch with you if they have a story or something they wanted to share? How would they get in touch with you?
Well, there are a couple of ways to do that. If you go to vvmf.org/echoes, that'll take you to the podcast's homepage. And from there, you can listen to episodes. You can make a donation specifically to supporting the podcast, or you can make a donation just supporting the overall organization, the fund. And there's also a place on that page where you can send us a note. You can fill out a little form and send us a note if you've got a story you'd like us to know about. The other way to do it is just to email echoes@vvmf.org.
Michael, thank you so much for coming home well, and sharing everything that you're doing. It is always amazing to hear these stories, and I'm so glad that there's somebody out there collecting and sharing and sort of fostering the ability so this very temporary knowledge is recorded and shared. Thank you so much for coming on well, and thanks for everything you do on Echoes of the Vietnam War podcast.
Well, I can't thank you enough for inviting me. I think the work that you guys are doing is so important. And of course, it's totally aligned with our mission, which is to honor those who served. So it's good that we finally met.
Thank you so much for coming home well.
Thanks for joining us this week on Coming Home Well with Dr. Tyler Piron. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. Thanks again. And until all are home and all are well, this is Coming Home Well.